The Corpus filled every viewport like a god's abandoned homework. 12 kilometers of alien alloy folded into geometry that human eyes slid off without purchase. Up close, the scale stopped being a number and became a feeling. The slow, tidal vertigo of standing next to something that once ate warships for breakfast and now just floated there, venting violet into the dark and slowly, patiently, becoming the galaxy's most legally complicated piece of real estate. The ghost crew came in a salvage barge. One salvage barge. Elias Thorne had specifically chosen the oldest, most legally ambiguous vessel he could lease, the kind of ship with so many hull repairs it qualified as a floating legal argument. He stood at the forward viewport in an oil-stained Admiral's jacket over a canvas jumpsuit, clipboard tucked under one arm, watching the Federation repo drones circle the wreck in slow, patient orbits. They were waiting for clearance to board. They had been waiting 4 days. He hadn't given it to them. The hull breach the ghost crew had cut with industrial mining lasers was narrow enough to fit the crew in single file, wide enough to qualify as a maintenance access point under Subsection 42 of the Maritime Salvage Act. Thorne had spent 6 hours with a laser scribe carving the appropriate permit number into the surrounding alloy before anyone went through. The crew thought he was stalling. He was, but not for the reason they thought. He was giving the alien AI fragments enough time to register the intrusion as authorized maintenance access rather than a hostile boarding. There was a difference. One was a crime. The other was paperwork, and paperwork was Thorne's preferred terrain. The inside of the Corpus smelled like ancient dust and electricity, and something older than either. A mineral smell, like a cave that had never known weather. Like a room that had been sealed for 10,000 years and finally breathed out. Emergency lighting pulsed orange in irregular rhythms. Not broken exactly, but breathing. 12-meter thick alloy plates formed corridors wide enough to march battalions through, and the ghost crew walked in a tight cluster, boots clanging on decking that hummed faintly with residual charge. The sound carried differently here. Too big a space, too much mass absorbing the echoes, so that every footstep returned as a low, diffuse murmur from directions that didn't quite make sense. Grease Miller walked point, prosthetic arm extended, a passive scanner wired directly to her neural interface. The readout on her forearm flickered, recursive logic loops in the primary AI core, cycling at approximately 400 millisecond intervals. The ship's alien mind chasing its own tail through a maze of unresolved command protocols that had been running since the moment the Corpus went dark. The toaster's arguing with itself. Grease didn't look back. Something about docking rights and import duties. Whoever wrote its laws was very thorough and also apparently insane. Thorne consulted his clipboard. Good. Then it'll understand what we're filing. The Federation commander's voice crackled over the open channel. He had the tone of a man who had written several memos about this situation and fully expected the memos to be sufficient. Thorne, you are in violation of Sector 6 Acquisition Order 779 Alpha. Stand down and allow Federation personnel to. I'm not stealing a warship, Commander. I'm performing a court-ordered safety inspection on a very large, very dangerous piece of litter. The channel went quiet for 3 seconds. Somewhere in that silence, a legal team started sweating. The handshake with the alien AI took 40 minutes. Grease rigged a portable server to broadcast the crew's maintenance credentials in binary packets, timed to match the AI's recursive loop intervals, the alien equivalent of knocking in rhythm with someone's heartbeat. The ship didn't open up exactly. It just stopped treating them as an anomaly. One moment they were intruders. The next, they were logged as Janitorial Supervisory Unit 17 with full access to non-combat maintenance corridors. The Federation's override codes, fed in by the repo drone fleet, bounced off an alien firewall that hadn't been written for human law and would not be rewritten for it any time soon. The ship was now technically operating under Alien Union protocol. There was no human definition for what that meant. That was, Thorne noted, extremely useful. He broadcast the salvage claim at 1300 hours. He sent it on every frequency, logged it with the Seoul Maritime Records Bureau, and dispatched a physical notarized copy via automated postal drone to Secretary Vane's office. Then he set up his fold-out chair on the bridge and opened a thermos of coffee. The first Federation drone that tried to board was stopped by 2 pages of maritime statute. The air in the bridge tasted of ionized metal and old circuitry. The Corpus settled around them in long, deep pulses. The sound of a structure 12 kilometers across responding to the ghost of tidal forces, groaning at frequencies more felt than heard. The second wave came 36 hours later, a proper Federation audit fleet, 3 frigates, a bureaucratic cutter, and an inspector who found Elias Thorne waiting at the main airlock in a neon safety vest, clipboard in hand, looking like a man who had invented the safety vest and had opinions about everyone else's. "I'd love to let you in, Inspector, but I haven't seen your Hazardous Environment Tier 5 certification. It would be a crime to let you die on my property." The inspector, a rail-thin career auditor who took personal offense at loose rivets, stared past Thorne's shoulder at the sensor readouts. Lethal radiation. The numbers were right there on his own instruments. What those instruments could not distinguish from genuine contamination was the electromagnetic output of 12 microwave ovens running with their doors open, positioned at precise intervals through the first 3 corridors, tuned to produce exactly the signature the alien sensors would register as a hazardous work environment under Statute 1910.120. The ovens had been running for 16 hours. Grease had heated a considerable amount of soup in the process. Thorne handed the inspector a physical drive. "Actuarial risk assessment is on page 270. Your insurance carrier will want to review it before authorizing entry. I'd estimate 48 to 72 hours for review." The auditor retreated to consult with legal. The Corpus groaned behind Thorne, a deep structural sound, like 12 kilometers of alloy settling into a new opinion of itself. In the engineering corps, Grease Miller was already 3 hours into the next problem. The primary coolant line had been sheared clean by whatever killed the Corpus in the first place, and the reactor, a dark matter containment system roughly the size of a city block, was building pressure in long, slow, dangerous pulses. The Ghost crew had located 400 salvaged copper busbars, 2 drums of industrial cooling gel, and a length of ceramic conduit that was almost the right diameter. The gap it needed to bridge was 4 meters of open space between 2 conduit terminations, with superheated plasma threading through the air between them in lazy, luminescent arcs that smelled like burning copper and the end of good ideas. Grease looked at it for about 4 seconds. "Give me the gel." 17 minutes followed that no engineering school would ever sanction. The fire gel bridged the gap. The bus bars went across in overlapping rows, held with duct tape and 1 alien fastener stripped from a nearby panel and applied with a hammer. The ceramic conduit clicked into place. The reactor accepted the fix the way a dying man accepts a tourniquet, with profound, uncomplicated relief. Then it kicked over. Not a hum, a scream. A high-pitched electrical whine that climbed 3 octaves before dropping into a bass register that vibrated the fillings in teeth and the fluid in eardrums, and then the emergency orange went out and the lighting shifted to a deep, throbbing alien violet. The excess heat had nowhere to go. The exterior vents opened manually, and the Corpus exhaled. It's not an engine anymore. It's a 20-million-ton tea kettle. Try not to be downwind when it whistles. The violet steam hit the Federation recon wing like a wall. Ionized particulate, charged by the dark matter leak, scrambled their targeting sensors completely. 3 frigates went operationally blind. The fleet's formation held by momentum while the crews found things to do with their hands that did not involve targeting locks. By the time the Federation sensors cleared, Thorne had filed 2 additional documents and started on a 3rd. The final piece was the orbit. The Corpus could not move, not meaningfully, not yet, but it was already sitting in a natural Lagrange point, gravitationally stable, and Thorne had spent a day with orbital mechanics charts calculating exactly what a kinetic strike at this position would generate. The debris field's natural delta V would carry it along a vector that intersected directly with Earth's communications satellite constellation at periapsis. Kessler syndrome. One strike, and the GPS grid went dark. Then weather satellites. Then broadcasting infrastructure. The Federation could fire exactly once before the concept of satellite television became historical. The general's voice came through crisp and cold. "You can fire that railgun, General, but I hope you like navigating by the stars, because you'll never have satellite TV again." The Corpus held its orbit. The Federation held its fire. In the recursive loops of the alien AI, a bureaucratic process ran on, solemnly, for reasons that no longer applied to a universe that had moved on without it. 1,000 years of alien regulation, administering a vessel whose circumstances had changed entirely, cycling through the same unresolvable inputs, issuing the same undeliverable outputs, patient and precise and utterly, perfectly useless. Every institution Thorne had ever served had felt approximately like this from the inside. He found it strangely comforting. He clicked the log recorder on. Day 4. Interesting discovery. When you threaten the Wi-Fi, people get very cooperative very quickly. File that under Subsection 1 of every negotiation you will ever have. The violet steam vented into the dark. The repo drones held their orbit. Somewhere in the Federation fleet, a commander was composing a memo that would not be sufficient. The patchwork started in the 3rd week. Thorne had requisitioned, through channels that were technically legal if you read the small print at speed, a flotilla of automated cargo haulers loaded with Terran scrap, decommissioned tank hulls, satellite dishes, sections of offshore drilling platforms, the skin of 3 retired atmospheric re-entry vehicles that had been heading for smelting on Ganymede, the kind of material that no recycling algorithm would flag as threatening because it had no resale value and registered on sensors as precisely what it appeared to be: junk. It covered the Corpus like scar tissue, dense, irregular, expanding outward from the first breach point in concentric rings of improvised armor that no human engineering committee would have approved, and no alien targeting system had been designed to recognize as a threat. The Ghost crew worked in mag boots on the exterior hull, moving in short, careful shifts because the temperature differential between sunward and shadow sides was 40 degrees and the footing was alien alloy that had been vacuum exposed for years. Each piece of scrap went down without bolts. Grease had reprogrammed the external gravity plating to function as a 3-dimensional adhesive, applying precise localized force to press each piece into position against the hull. From the barge, the result looked like a junkyard had fallen onto a cathedral and been pressed flat. From inside, it looked like ingenuity. From a Federation targeting console, it looked like nothing at all. "It doesn't have to be pretty, son. It just has to be harder than the railgun slug hitting it." Thorne said it to the youngest crew member, a structural engineer from the Callisto shipyards who had been staring at the latest section of hull work with the expression of someone watching their professional reputation dissolve in real time. The engineer looked at the overlapping plates, each set at an angle no design algorithm would choose deliberately, creating interference geometries that scattered radar returns into noise. He looked at the wiring running under the nearest plate. Every piece of scrap stack wired into the passive detection grid, converting the armor into a nervous system that covered every approach vector simultaneously. He looked at the whole thing for another few seconds and then began helping without saying anything further. There was nothing to say. The armor worked. The physics did not care whether it was pretty. That was, Thorne had always maintained, the fundamental advantage of engineering over politics. The universe has only the one standard, and it applies to everyone equally. The air inside had changed. The humidity from the biodomes had spread through the ventilation, a sweet metallic smell, the blue grain harvest already into its third cycle in the hydroponic bays. The alien lichen had taken to the alien fertilizer with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting millennia for the right conditions. Plants glowing faint blue in the grow lights, protein-dense, caffeinated beyond any reasonable engineering specification, growing at rates that made the yield reports look like someone had made a decimal point error. The crew had stopped eating rations 3 weeks ago. Nobody had said anything about it officially. Grease found the propulsion answer on a Tuesday. She'd been mapping the engine architecture for 11 days, chasing schematics through corridors that grew progressively wider and stranger until the architecture stopped obeying assumptions she'd brought from Terran shipyards. The main drives were not engines in any sense she'd been trained to recognize. They were particle accelerators, literal linear accelerators, using sequential magnetic coils to push mass to relativistic velocities for thrust. You ran mass through one end, the ship went the other direction. Grease read the schematic twice, checked the coil polarity at the terminus, and then stood completely still for about 30 seconds. Then she called Thorne. "If I flip the terminus magnets," she said, "the thing that goes fast isn't the ship." It took 4 hours to prepare the test. They selected a vector pointing at confirmed empty space, 3 million kilometers off the port bow. The Leviathan cannon, Grease had named it before they finished the modifications, which Thorne took as a confidence indicator, drew power in a cascade that pulled 400 terajoules per millisecond from the dark matter reactor. The violet lighting dropped to a deep, aching red. Every loose object on the ship moved 6 inches to the left simultaneously, as if the Corpus itself had flinched. And then the sound arrived, not a bang, not a crack, but a structural groan that started in the hull and worked its way inward through every bulkhead and deck plate and human bone for 10 full seconds. A low harmonic that made liquid in containers ripple in concentric rings long after the vibration had passed. At the terminus, a compressed zone of spatial stress accelerated outward. The region of space they'd targeted ceased to contain its previous contents. Not destroyed. Destruction implied something remained. The sensor log showed a clean absence, not a null return. A gap where the instrument had nothing to interpret, because the space it was interrogating had ceased to be the same space it had been. The recoil moved the 20-million-ton Corpus 3 inches to the left. "We aren't shooting at them, Sarah. We're just removing the space they happen to be occupying." Sarah Miller stared at the targeting readout for a long time. Nothing glowed, nothing burned. There was simply a region of the scan where the universe had quietly stopped providing information. She had spent 20 years in heavy engineering, and she had no vocabulary for this, so she said nothing and went back to the coolant calculations. The maintenance bots had been cataloged as storage, 10,000 of them, found in a hangar bay on the lower decks, small, fast, multi-limbed, built for repair operations in hard vacuum. Their AI was simple to the point of elegance. Identify target state. Identify deviation from target state. Correct deviation. Grease spent 2 days reading the definition parameters before she understood what she was looking at. Broken, she explained to Thorne, means not part of the Corpus. She rewrote the directive structure in 48 hours, feeding the updated parameters through the maintenance network in rolling batches while the bots continued their existing routines, unaware of the shift until the new definition propagated. The maintenance swarm redeployed to the perimeter with the quiet efficiency of things that had been designed to fix problems and had simply been given a new definition of the problem. The first Federation probed across the boundary line wasn't targeted. The swarm landed on it, 1,200 individual units attaching in under 3 seconds, and then the disassembly began with professional calm. Fasteners unfastened, panels lifted, components sorted by material composition into neat categories on the hull surface. 90 seconds from first contact to sorted components, arrayed in orderly rows like the world's most thorough evidence log. The probe's transponder kept broadcasting for 11 of those 90 seconds. The signal it sent back to the Federation watch post contained full sensor data from inside the swarm. What the watch officer saw was not chaos, not aggression. Methodical, calm, professional dismantlement, the way you'd take apart a clock if you wanted to understand every component and intended to use all of them. The Federation had sent instruments of surveillance. The Corpus had sent janitors. It was not a fight. It was a reclassification. Technically, they didn't attack. They just performed an unscheduled teardown for recycling purposes. The watch officer's report used the word distressing 4 times. Thorne filed the report under useful outcomes and added the probe's component value to the sovereign ledger under salvage revenue. The blue-grain move had been building for weeks. The outer colonies under Federation supply restriction were running protein deficits that would become demographic problems inside 18 months. Public record, Federation Trade Bureau quarterly report, which apparently the Federation's own strategic planning division had not read carefully. 12 containers filed as humanitarian medical supplies arrived at Callisto before the legal challenge cleared processing. The settlement ate. Then they asked for more. Then they started talking to other settlements, and those settlements started talking to their representatives, and the political mathematics of the outer belt began to shift in ways that had nothing to do with guns. The Federation provides bureaucracy. I provide bread. Guess who they'll shoot for first? He said it to the log recorder, watching the incoming message traffic from the outer colonies spike in a pattern that looked, on the comms graph, like the early stages of a constituency. The mercenary boarding party came on a Wednesday. Corporate proxy operations ran on a standard work week, which told Thorne exactly which holding companies to start sending invoices to. The mercenaries had identified a section of scrap stack that looked on long-range sensor sweep like a weak patch. 3 overlapping plates at mismatched angles, apparently misaligned during installation. It was the entrance to Sector 4, which Greece had retrofitted 3 weeks prior in anticipation of exactly this attempt, knowing that any competent hostile reconnaissance would identify it as the path of least resistance. They blew the entry charge and moved through the smoke into a corridor where the gravity was running at 4 standard and the atmosphere had been replaced with fire-suppressant foam. 4-gravity foam is not a combat environment. It is the logistics problem of extraction, and the Ghost crew handled it with plasma cutters and magnetic tethers while the mercenaries worked out which direction down was currently pointing. It was not a battle. It lasted less than 4 minutes. It was a workplace incident. The itemized bill for emergency biohazard cleaning services went to the parent corporation the following morning. Foam disposal, structural inspection, ventilation restoration, medical assessment, psychological consultation for Ghost crew members required to be present, and a 40% disturbance premium under Subsection 12 of the Sovereign Occupancy Compact. The corporation did not pay. Thorne added the balance to the ledger under accounts receivable and began calculating compound interest at a rate that he had determined was technically legal under 3 separate maritime frameworks. He clicked the recorder on. Day 31. The Corpus now has functional weapons, self-replicating food supply, autonomous perimeter defense, and custom armor invisible to sensors. For reference, this is more than most nations achieve in their first century. File under adequate progress. The violet steam vented into the dark. In the recursive loops of the alien AI, something was accumulating. Not quite awareness, not quite decision, but weight. The growing pressure of a system processing inputs that had no matching outputs, running protocols designed for a universe that no longer matched its parameters. Every institution Thorne had ever worked inside had felt like this from the inside eventually. The question was always what happened when the pressure finally found a direction. The law, Thorne had always maintained, was a force multiplier, not a shield. A shield was passive, reactive, the tool of someone who expected to be hit and had decided to take it. The law, applied with sufficient precision and no mercy whatsoever, was a weapon that hit targets you never had to look at directly. It hit their lawyers, and their insurers, and their filing deadlines, and the people whose job it was to explain to very senior people why a very simple problem had become a very complicated one. The sovereign lien against the local Sun took 3 weeks to process through the colonial court's automated filing system. The legal theory was straightforward, if unprecedented. The Corpus, by occupying its current Lagrange point, was positioned between the star and a measurable portion of the inhabited system's inner planets. This constituted a provision of essential solar mitigation services, specifically the interception of approximately 0.4% of harmful radiation output that would otherwise reach inhabited surfaces. Thorne had commissioned an independent actuarial assessment. He had valued the service at 2.3 trillion credits per standard year, applied retroactively from the date of first occupation. The Federation's legal team took 48 hours to respond, which Thorne read as 48 hours of very senior people shouting at very junior people in rooms without windows. The response was a 40-page brief characterizing the claim as frivolous, unprecedented, and legally absurd. Thorne's counterbrief was 12 pages. The last page contained a single citation: Colonial Precedents Archive, Volume 47, Case Reference, Meridian Station versus Proxima Municipal Authority, in which a habitat had successfully claimed compensation for passive gravitational stabilization of a neighboring asteroid body. The citation was accurate. The Federation's own legal team had argued for the plaintiff in that case, 15 years prior. That was the thing about ancient colonial law. It had been written for a frontier where enforcement was sparse and creative interpretation was survival. The Federation had built its entire legal architecture on that foundation, because every galactic power eventually does. They had simply assumed, the way institutions always assume, that the creative interpreters would remain on their side of the table. The Federation legal team went quiet for 72 hours. The repo fleet arrived at the end of the second month. 43 vessels, led by a flag-class Dreadnought that was genuinely impressive until you put it next to the Corpus, at which point it looked like a thumbtack stuck to a cathedral wall. The fleet arranged itself in a standard encirclement pattern and broadcast a surrender demand on all frequencies. The Admiral gave Thorne 10 minutes. Thorne didn't power up weapons. He opened the violet steam vents to full, all of them, simultaneously, on a release pattern Greece had been designing for 3 weeks. The ionized discharge expanded outward in a controlled wave, filling a volume of space roughly the diameter of a small planet. The cloud caught sunlight at its edges and scattered it in faint violet halos. From Earth's surface at twilight, it was visible to the naked eye, a vast, softly luminous nebula that resolved, if you used a consumer-grade telescope at moderate magnification, into a pattern. The pattern was a QR code. The first civilian scan logged within 7 minutes of the cloud's full deployment. Within 48 hours, every adult on Earth's northern hemisphere with a phone and a clear sky had either scanned it themselves or been sent the link by someone who had. The link directed to a database server operating out of the Corpus's own communications array. 4.7 terabytes of Federation internal documents, budget authorizations, closed session proceedings, operational memos, recovered from the ship's own databanks, where the alien AI had been storing intercepted Federation signals since before the war began. The records had been accumulating for years, logged and filed with alien thoroughness by an AI that did not know what secrets were, only that information was information and information should be archived. The war crime authorizations were on page 1. The procurement fraud was on page 2. The closed session testimony regarding deliberate civilian infrastructure targeting was on page 3. Humanity had been told for 18 months that the war's collateral costs were unavoidable, that the decisions made in those sealed sessions had been difficult but necessary, that the people responsible had acted in good conscience under impossible conditions. Every government statement, every official inquiry, every carefully worded committee finding, all of it built on the assumption that the rooms where the real decisions happened had stayed closed. The rooms had not stayed closed. They had been sitting in an alien filing system, archived with alien thoroughness, waiting for a human being careless enough with a modem handshake to become someone the alien bureaucracy was willing to talk to. The Federation flagship did not fire. It had a different problem. Thorne had activated the gravity anchors, 17 massive emitters distributed through the Corpus's hull, originally designed for planetary approach operations. He'd reprogrammed the targeting parameters over 4 days, working through the schematics with grease, recalibrating the field gradient for a vessel-sized target rather than a continental plate. The flagship's captain had perhaps 40 seconds of warning before the gravitational gradient shifted around his ship. A sudden, smooth, irresistible reorientation of the local field. And then the Federation's finest vessel was moving, not under its own power, toward an open docking bay 3 kilometers wide that the Corpus obligingly held open. The flagship docked. "You're not attacking us, Admiral. You're just checking in for a very long, very expensive stay." The Admiral filed 12 objections in the first hour. Thorne's automated system acknowledged all 12, assigned them ticket numbers, and estimated a processing window of 4 to 6 standard weeks. The flagship was now under sovereign occupancy law, subject to Corpus jurisdiction, Corpus docking fees, and mandatory safety inspection under Corpus environmental standards. The docking fee accrued by the minute. The safety inspection backlog was significant. The salvage fee was the next instrument. The war had left substantial derelict hardware in the outer system. Standard post-conflict debris accumulation, predictable as weather. Under the Corpus's claimed salvage jurisdiction, every piece of that debris fell within Thorne's operational remit. He filed a cleanup claim, 1.5 times the Federation's current annual GDP, payable in mineral rights and territorial concessions across the asteroid belt. The Federation called it extortion. Thorne's brief called it remediation and cited 6 environmental restoration precedents. The mineral rights to the belt were, when surveyed by the Corpus's passive sensor array, considerably more valuable than the cleanup cost. The math was not complicated once you did it. The trade lanes were the second pressure point. Piracy had spiked in the outer belt since the war. Classic post-conflict instability, predictable and well-documented and apparently surprising to the Federation every single time it happened. The Leviathan cannon's effective range made the outer belt an extremely uncomfortable place to operate as a raider. Thorne had begun offering navigation safety assurance to independent traders on a subscription basis, 10% of cargo value, voluntary participation. The alternative was unsubscribed passage through a region where spatial anomalies had been recently documented. The subscriptions arrived faster than the blue-grain revenue, which had itself arrived faster than anything Thorne had projected. The Federation could not legally block it. The cannon was defensive. The fee was voluntary. The anomalies were not, technically, being produced by anything the Corpus's filed certifications acknowledged. Then Greece found the loom. She'd been chasing a power conduit anomaly through the lower levels for 2 weeks, deeper than any of the crew had gone, into sections where the architecture stopped obeying assumptions about which directions were permanent. Corridors that curved at angles, implying the designers had different opinions about spatial orientation. Chambers that were larger inside than the hull geometry suggested they should be. At the bottom of the anomaly was a space the size of a cathedral, and the cathedral was filled with what Greece's scanner initially logged as liquid metal curtains, shimmering, rippling planes of coherent matter suspended in magnetic fields, humming at a frequency that made her molars ache, and her inner ear insist that gravity was doing something unauthorized. She stood there for a long time, ran the mass spectrometer, ran it again, called up the power draw logs and traced the consumption curve back through the schematics. Not a weapon, not a reactor, a fabrication matrix, a nanite forge running on dark matter feeds, accepting raw mass input and producing structured matter output to molecular tolerances. It had been idling since the Corpus went dark, waiting for mass input it had never received, running maintenance cycles on its own components with the patient continuity of a system designed to operate on geological timescales. The scope of it settled over Thorne in the engineering bay when Grease walked him through the schematics. Not a printer for components, not a printer for structures, a printer for matter at any scale the input mass supported. Fed the right raw material, the right templates, it could reconstruct atmospheric chemistry, ecological substrate, planetary geology. The alien crew had not built a weapon and put a ship around it. They had built a tool for repairing the aftermath of weapons, and around that tool, they had built the one vessel in the known galaxy capable of transporting it anywhere it was needed. The Federation thinks we're squatters. Thorne sat with the schematics for a long time before he spoke. We're sitting on the thing that decides whether planets are habitable. The words sat in the air of the engineering bay. The loom hummed below them, patient and vast, waiting for input that would finally end the idling cycle it had run for years. Grease picked up a piece of scrap metal from the nearest workbench, a section of alien conduit, bent and scorched, and held it over the chamber railing. Below, the liquid metal curtains rippled toward it slightly, like a tide responding to a very small moon. Thorne clicked the recorder on. Day 63, recalibrating the scope of the project. It turns out the line between fortress and civilization is mostly a question of what you are choosing to build. File under revised objectives. Significant upward revision. He put the recorder down. He looked at the loom. He drank his coffee. Outside, the Federation flagship sat in its docking bay accumulating fees. The repo fleet held its formation around a fortress it could not fire on, defended by a legal structure it could not dismantle, owned by a man with a clipboard and a very long memory. And somewhere in the Federation's secured communications network, Secretary Vane was being briefed on the QR code. His response was not reportedly calm. The situation was about to escalate. Thorne had been waiting for it. Secretary Vane had the face of a man who had long believed that every problem was ultimately a spreadsheet problem, and that spreadsheets, given sufficient rows and correctly structured formulas, would yield to reason. He had held this belief for 42 years. It had served him well through budgetary crises, territorial disputes, treaty negotiations, and 3 separate interstellar incidents that had each seemed at the time uniquely intractable. The Corpus was the first situation in his career that had challenged the belief in a way he couldn't file under operational variance and revisit at the next quarterly review. The decommissioning order came through on a Tuesday. A system-wide safety hazard declaration, authorized at the highest executive level, granting Federation command authority to remotely trigger the Corpus's fail-safe shutdown sequence. The sequence had been designed by the original architects for exactly this contingency. Catastrophic vessel compromise, requiring rapid core collapse to prevent cascade damage. The authentication protocol was clean. The authority was unambiguous. Thorne read the technical appendix twice. A controlled collapse at this scale was a regional extinction event relative to the original architect's engineering tolerances. The architects had built moon-sized ships. Their definition of controlled was flexible. Thorne filed 2 documents. The first was a heritage registration under the Interstellar Heritage and Cultural Preservation Act, designating the Corpus as a historic monument of galactic significance and active cultural practice site for the descendants of the vessel's original crew. The AI fragments in the recursive logic loops were, under the Act's definitions of continuity and cultural inheritance, recognized inheritors. Living, or proximate enough to living that the automated registration system accepted the designation without triggering a human review flag. Cultural inheritors with standing. Cultural inheritors whose heritage site was, under the Act's enforcement provisions, protected from deliberate destruction on pain of Tier 1 galactic war crime classification. Personal criminal exposure for the authorizing officer was, per the statute, non-transferable and non-pardonable. The second document was a technical notification to the Colonial Astronomical Survey regarding a modification to the loom's output configuration. Thorne had spent 11 days on this with Greece. The loom's gravitational substrate range, running at full operational power, extended to approximately the same distance as Earth's moon. The modification linked the loom's tidal substrate feeds to the moon's orbital mechanics, not as a weapon, not as a destructive mechanism, but as a dependency. The loom had been, at full power, providing a low-level gravitational supplement to the moon's tidal interaction with Earth's oceans. Not because this was necessary, because Thorne had made it necessary incrementally over 6 weeks, using the loom's output precisely calibrated to become part of the system. If the Corpus's power signature dropped below operational threshold, the supplement ceased. The tidal interaction reverted to its pre-loom baseline. The baseline was different from what the oceans had been calibrated to for 6 weeks. Different was not catastrophic. Thorne was careful about this in the technical notification because the last thing he needed was a document that could be characterized as a threat. But different was sufficiently disruptive to global coastal systems, shipping lanes, storm prediction models, and the agricultural schedules of approximately 400 million people that the Colonial Astronomical Survey was legally required to classify any action causing that disruption as a Tier 3 environmental interference event. The decommissioning order would cause that disruption. Pressing the button was now, formally, a federal crime in 3 jurisdictions and a Tier 3 environmental interference event in all of them simultaneously. Secretary Vane's face appeared on the holographic display, looking the way a man looks when he realizes the spreadsheet has columns he didn't know existed, and they all have numbers in them. He had the careful flatness of someone managing a significant emotional response in a professional context, and not quite succeeding. Behind him, through the window of whatever office he'd taken the call from, Thorne could see advisors moving with the purposeful urgency of people being asked questions they do not have answers to. You can press that button, Mr. Secretary, but I hope you've all learned how to swim in a world without tides. A pause on the Federation end. Not the pause of someone thinking, the pause of someone watching the last viable move disappear from a board they'd thought they were winning. I'm not a rebel, Secretary. I'm just a man with a very long lease and a very big hammer. Vane's screen went dark. The decommissioning order was formally withdrawn 11 hours later, followed by a provisional recognition of Corpus sovereign status pending treaty negotiations, followed by a request, notably lacking Vane's usual corporate jargon, that Thorne please stop adding line items to the sovereign ledger pending the treaty process. Thorne acknowledged the request. He did not stop adding line items. The loom's first full operational cycle began at 0400 hours on a Thursday, which was the kind of time the universe seemed to prefer for large things. Quiet, unhurried, witnessed mainly by the people on watch who would spend years afterwards struggling to describe what they'd seen to people who hadn't been there. Thorne stood on the bridge and watched the output telemetry scroll across 3 screens, raw mass in, structured matter out. Template locked on atmospheric chemistry correction for Earth's northern hemisphere particulate load, the acid deposition and ozone disruption from 18 months of orbital weapons exchanges, the slow accumulating damage that had kept building quietly, the way damage does, while everyone was watching the larger spectacle. It took 4 hours for the first cycle to complete its primary pass. 4 hours of the loom running its corrections in the upper atmosphere, steady and methodical, at a scale that no human technology had approached. Not destroying anything, not imposing, returning, adjusting the chemistry toward a baseline that the planet had maintained for decades before the weapons arrived and changed the math. The loom didn't make a sound. The cathedral chamber hummed at its tooth-aching frequency. The liquid metal curtains rippled. and in the upper atmosphere above the northern hemisphere, the particulate load began shifting, not dramatically, not visibly from the ground, but measurably, the way things shift when you apply exactly the right tool in exactly the right place. Chemistry returning to itself, gradual, systematic, without drama, because the universe doesn't require drama. It only requires the right input. The ghost crew gathered at the viewport in ones and twos over the following hour. Nobody announced it. Nobody sent a message. People simply arrived, the way people do when something is happening that they want to have been present for. They were engineers, all of them, people trained to quantify, to measure, to express significance in units and tolerances and margin calculations. Standing at the viewport of a moon-sized alien vessel watching their home planet's atmosphere being repaired by a machine no human had built, using a process no human fully understood, they had nothing useful to say. So they said nothing. They stood and watched Earth turn below them, looking for the change, mostly unable to see it directly. The instruments said it was happening. That was enough. It had always been enough for people who'd spent careers trusting instruments over intuition. One of the younger engineers put her hand flat against the viewport glass. Nobody commented on it. After a moment, a few others did the same. The docking queue started building before the treaty was signed. Independent traders first, the ones who'd been taking the navigation safety assurance subscriptions, who'd been eating blue grain, who'd heard through the outer colony networks that the Corpus was offering retrofit services. Then colony ships, 2 decommissioned mining platforms, a research station that wanted relocation. They came in ones and twos, and the maintenance swarm met each arrival at the approach boundary, running diagnostic sweeps, calculating retrofit costs, logging everything in the sovereign ledger under a new account category that Thorne had simply labeled commerce. The Corpus wasn't only a fortress now. It hadn't stopped being one. The Leviathan cannons tracked every approach vector. The swarm patrolled the perimeter. The scrap stack armor made sensors read garbage. But it was more than a fortress. It was a port, a factory, a legal jurisdiction, a breadbasket, a repair yard, an archive, a power that was being reluctantly recognized by a federation that had run out of options for not recognizing it. The thing Thorne had spent 2 months defending had become, while he was defending it, a thing worth defending for reasons that had nothing to do with the original legal claim. He found Grease on the bridge at 0600, both of them watching the docking queue grow on the approach screen. She had violet steam grease on her prosthetic arm and the expression of someone who had calculated a very large number and was still in the early stages of processing what it meant. Check the inventory, Grease. I think we're missing a few thousand tons of ego. She looked at him, then at the docking queue, then at the corner of the display where the loom telemetry ran its quiet numbers, mass in, atmosphere out, working its corrections in the patient, methodical way of something that had been waiting years for someone to give it a useful problem. Yeah. A pause while she looked at the queue. We'll loom some. Thorne clicked the recorder on one last time. We didn't beat them with a bigger gun. We beat them with a better accountant and a very, very long memory. He set the recorder down, finished his coffee. The mug was fabricated from recycled alien hull plating by the loom on a slow cycle. In a quiet hour 3 weeks ago, the first non-structural item the machine had produced, a calibration exercise that had also been, without anyone announcing it, the first thing manufactured by a recognized sovereign power that had not existed 12 weeks prior. It held heat well. It had a slight permanent weight to it. Outside, the violet steam vented in slow, gorgeous plumes into the dark. Below, Earth turned and breathed a little easier, its atmosphere making quiet corrections that no instrument small enough for a civilian to own could detect yet, but that would be measurable by spring and demonstrably significant by the following year. The Federation's flagship was still docked, accruing fees, its crew technically subject to Corpus environmental regulations, and a pending safety inspection that had been scheduled, rescheduled, and scheduled again. The alien AI ran its recursive loops with the patient thoroughness of something designed to administer a vessel across geological time, processing inputs that no longer matched the universe they'd been written for, which was, Thorne had come to understand, not so different from most institutions, not so different from most things that had outlasted the circumstances of their creation and kept running anyway, on protocol and momentum, because stopping was structurally harder than continuing. The first ship in the docking queue had already received its retrofit estimate. The second was negotiating terms. The third was asking about blue-grain futures contracts. Nobody was going to throw any of this away.